Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with philosopher and theologian Ken Samples. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sandra.
We're going to be talking about a question that came in from one of our viewers. So we get questions from social media, and they want to know, is the Bible reliable? Don't just say yes, though. Give us some more meat to that. So just from a skeptical perspective, some people will want to know, if they're Christians, they want to know if the Bible's reliable just from their journey to faith, to kind of strengthen their faith.
Sure.
And to help them engage with others. And those who are not Christians, that's going to be a question they're going to wonder. Why would I trust this old book written by men thousands of years ago?
Yeah.
So how would you begin to address such a question?
I would say that we have an ancient book, but we live in the modern world. And there are challenges. In the ancient world, there were no Xerox machines. In the ancient world, writing was expensive, and it was a premium. The first paper was papyrus. It could disintegrate if it wasn't placed in the proper place. So many books and manuscripts that were written in the ancient world, Sandra, have not made it into the modern world. I think particularly, for example, St. Augustine talked about Cicero's Hortensius, and he said that turned him on to philosophy and set a fire under him. It's disappeared. We don't have a copy of it. Interestingly enough, when it comes to the New Testament, we have an abundance of manuscripts that have survived into the modern world. So in terms of the number of manuscript copies, we could say the New Testament is the best attested document of antiquity. Now, that doesn't mean the Bible is right. It doesn't mean the New Testament is correct. But it does mean that we have a lot of manuscripts that we can examine, and they go back a long way. I mean, we have papyrus manuscripts of maybe from the 2nd century. We have codices. Those would be more like your book type that contain sometimes all of the Old Testament or all of the New Testament, go back to the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. So in terms of manuscript analysis, the more manuscripts you got, the better position you're in terms of being able to say, hey, we can trace this, we can track it. In that sense, I think it's really good evidence.
Yeah, and so, I think that's just so impressive to think of how difficult it was to not only write, but then to make sure that the writings were saved and to last for so long. So the fact that they've lasted for so long, like you've said, it doesn't mean that they're reliable, but it does show this long history of them existing, and those can be translated to modern day English, which is great. That kind of gets you into the door to have that conversation. But what can we learn from history that points to the Bible's reliability?
Okay, so if we take that first idea and we have what we call textual criticism, that's actually a science. It also involves art, but it is a science. And that would be where textual scholars would compare manuscripts, and they would look for, and as an editor you can appreciate this, there were copying errors in the Bible. You know, instead of epsilon iota, it was iota epsilon. They inverted the letters. So looking at those manuscripts, scholars can track them and find, well, which were the earliest, and do they agree? Now, if the manuscripts were filled with contradictions, then we would think, uh-oh, we've got a big problem. But we can see that there are early manuscripts. I mean, there are particular groups. Islam, for example, says the Judeo-Christian Bible is corrupted. But because we have so many manuscripts going back so far, we can see that the Bible we have today matches well with the Bible of the ancient world, the medieval world. Another good reason to think we're in pretty good shape when it comes to reliability.
So that's from a historical perspective, although you did say that it is a science. But what from science can we learn that points to the Bible's reliability?
Well, I would say that textual criticism actually comes under the category of science. But let me add this historically. We've got a dozen or more non-Christian authors, ancient non-Christian authors. Some of them are Jewish, some of them are Roman, some are Greek, some are Roman officials, some are writers. And they mention in the 2nd century, they mention that Christianity was growing. They talk about what they had heard about Christianity, for example, and they basically summarize, and that summary is very consistent with what we know the New Testament says, that Jesus was a great preacher and a healer from Galilee. It even says his disciples claimed that he rose from the dead. Now, none of this corroborates the truth of the New Testament or the fact of the resurrection, but I think it is a confirmation. People writing and thinking in the 2nd century said, yes, this is what we saw, this is what we observed, and their record corresponds well with what's in the New Testament. I'm not sure we could have more than that, in the sense that if we had early writers contradicting, then I think we'd have a big problem.
Wasn't there a shift culturally in when the Sabbath was acknowledged? Because I think that shift in the culture points to there must have been a catalyst to shift the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday.
Exactly. So the Sabbath in the Hebrew Bible, what we would call the Old Testament, sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. That's the day of worship. The other days of the week have no theological or doctrinal significance. The early Christians started meeting on the first day of the week, Sunday. Why did they do that? That was the day celebrating the Lord's resurrection. So what caused this change from the Sabbath to what we would call the Lord's Day? The only thing that they can point to is Christians saw it as a celebration of the resurrected Christ. I think that's one more evidence of the evidences for the resurrection.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, Ken. You have plenty of books that we can point our readers to. Which would you recommend for a question like this?
Thank you. I think Without a Doubt has a couple chapters that would be very helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So if you would like to learn more about this topic, go to support.reasons.org and search for Without a Doubt.